Thank you for staying for the second part of the symposium. For our panel, we call Poland Here, There, and Elsewhere. To think about Poland or Polish studies, not just about Poland, or what is Poland helpful to think with? What can we learn about other things when we study and we teach and we write about Poland? So I think that it might also echo some of the questions that were discussed and asked by Brian in the first panel, asked by Ron Suni just now, or also by Kasia Kietlinska. But before we start, I will introduce our speakers. And I will start by, in the order they are seated, yes. Okay, so Raymond Patton is an associate professor of history and the faculty director of the honors program at John Jay College of Criminal Justice at CUNY, the City University of New York. His scholarship, including Punk Crisis, the Global Punk Revolution, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2018, examines the intersection of modern Eastern European and global cultural history. And I must say that I was the chair of your dissertation was Brian. I was on that dissertation. It was a fabulous dissertation with links to every time you would read. It had to be read online because you would read and then click and then you would get a sound bite of some punk rock. So it was really innovative. Then the book is fabulous. I'm very glad that it saw the light of day by a major press. Ray's currently working on a book under the working title In Between Empire, Polish Travel Writers and Colonialism, which is about how Poles position themselves with respect to non-European victims of colonialism in travel writing in the 19th and 20th centuries. So thinking about decolonizing and the role of Polish studies in this, that will be really interesting to hear you perhaps talk about this. He received his PhD in history in 2011 and had an MA in Russian and Eastern European studies before that, both from the University of Michigan, and a BA in history and philosophy from the University of Georgia. Jessica Robbins-Panko, or Jess, as we call her, is an associate professor at the Institute of Gerontology and the Department of Anthropology at Wayne State University. So we're very lucky to have actually Jessica, or Jess, still being part of our community here in Ann Arbor. She received her PhD in anthropology and a graduate certificate from CREASE from the University of Michigan, and her BA in anthropology and music from Williams College. Her research explores aging, memory, kinship, and personhood in a historical, political, economic perspective in both Poland and Michigan. Her first book, Aging Nationally in Contemporary Poland, Memory, Kinship, and Personhood, was published in 2021 by Rutgers University Press. Last but not least, Lenny Ureña Valerio is an associate director for program development in the Latin American and Iberian Institute, and associate research professor in the history department at the University of New Mexico. She received a BA in history from the University of Puerto Rico and an MA and PhD in Central East European history from the University of Michigan. Her primary research interests include imperial and colonial studies, European migration to Latin America, Polish and German diasporas in Brazil, and the history of medicine and public health. Her book, Colonial Fantasies, Imperial Realities, Race, Science, and the Making of Polishness on the Fringes of the German Empire, 1840-1920, was the winner of the 2020 Kulczycki Book Award in Polish Studies, awarded by ACES. And it received an honorable mention for the 2020 Health Prize for the best book by a woman in Slavic, Eastern European, Eurasian Studies, awarded by the Association for Women in Slavic Studies. So to the three of you, welcome and thank you for being here. And I think that by reading your bios and your research, I mean, there's interesting overlap in different career trajectories, starting with Poland and expanding to different cases, but also in thinking about Poland more globally. So I'd like you guys to think about, first, I've some questions I may have suggested in a previous email to you. To reflect on the fact that you have completed dissertations and first books on Poland, and from there you moved on to considering other cases or to work more comparatively. And that's something that I also did in my second book. I wrote my first book on Poland, my second book was on Quebec, and I wrote that book on Quebec with the Polish case in mind. So that second book was deeply comparative, even though I did not really mention Poland in it. And I think that some of your work then and now is also in comparative in important ways. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about the kind of questions the Polish case helped you ask in your dissertation and beyond, and that you may not have asked if you had not worked on Poland first. So why don't we start with you, Lenny?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for the invitation. When I received the invitation, I was thinking, why they're inviting me? But since I didn't end up in Polish studies, but I'm deeply interested in researching about Polishness and Polish concerns in the 19th century. And I also want to thank Marisha, Donna Parmalee, Brian, you guys helped me so much while I was here. Ron was my boss here at the Weister Institute for Historical Studies. And when I when I received my PhD, I actually stayed with the University of Michigan working as a staff member at the International Institute. When I graduated, I had the option to go back to the University of Puerto Rico as an adjunct professor, but then the Center for Latin American Caribbean Studies needed help with a big proposal for the U.S. Department of Education, and I decided to stay, and I stayed for more than what I wanted, but so, and I made a career out of administration, and it was thanks to all the wonderful colleagues that I had at the International Institute. And also, I remember when I was taking a Polish class with Piotr Westwalewicz. We were finishing the third year of the course, and the class got together and submitted a proposal and met with Marisha to approve fourth year Polish. And we were successful. We felt empowered, and Marisha said, yes, we have the funding. All of this to say that I didn't have a traditional academic path. When I was admitted into the University of Michigan, my interest in Eastern Europe and Central Europe was sparked by the Balkan Wars. At the time I was graduating from high school, it was, and the aftermath, it was what I will hear about during my undergraduate studies. And I think it's the same happening now. The Ukraine war is probably sparking interest in the region. For good or worse, but that was when I decided to apply to Michigan. I always wanted to do a colonial project, because coming from the Caribbean and studying at the University of Puerto Rico, the colonial question being a territory from the US is always present. And I always wanted to problematize colonialism within Europe. So I proposed to do research on the German Empire and colonial relations with the Balkans. And then I met with Brian during recruitment weekend. He's like, how about Poland? I think that would be better. And I'm like, yeah, why not? Makes sense. So all of this to say that I came to the university with already a comparative project. Mm-hmm. My work has always been comparative and transnational. By the way, Brian said that it was good to recruit someone from outside Europe and Poland, because it will push the questions of Polish relations, and I hope I didn't disappoint. And so I was always preoccupied with this comparative aspect, because I want, and the Polish case was a wonderful case for me because it allowed me to push the boundaries in post-colonial studies back then between this framework of the colonized and colonizer. Well, Polish studies gave me the tools to study that you can be the colonized in some contexts, but you can also be the colonizer in other countries, in other contexts. So my dissertation, I studied the two main contexts, the Prussian Polish provinces and the African German colonies in the 19th century. And then for the book, and since I was already working in Latin American studies, I added the Latin American case. So it helped me study internal colonization process in Europe and also different types of overseas colonialism outside Europe. And bringing the case of Latin America was wonderful because I could study Polish agency in founding colonies in Brazil. So I hope that answered your question.
And I think it's actually fascinating to hear that trajectory being directed in the right field, gently but persuasively to do Poland. But I think that Poland is precisely interesting because of this, as both a colonized with the partitions, but also colonizing, the Kresy, parts of Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, and there is a legacy of that is becoming also more and more studied in the field.
And also because I was a historian of the Polish partitions, it forced me to be comparative. Because I remember when I was a student, I was reading wonderful monographs of Prussian partitions, the Russian case. And for me, it was very hard to limit myself to one place because the subjects that I was studying were in constant conversation. I studied Polish physicians, so they were developing professional networks and going beyond that part of the partition, beyond the Prussian-Polish partitions.
And I think it might be interesting also for you to discuss your dissertation, which is on Wrocław, primarily, which is a post-German town with people, a lot of the elderly people were from the former Polish lands, the eastern borderlands.
Yes, absolutely. Before I do that, I should say thank you, everyone, so much. It is such a delight and honor and joy to be here amongst all of you, so many colleagues, old friends, former teachers, now colleagues. It is just a total treat and delight, and I do feel so fortunate to still be so close by down the road in Detroit, although it does keep me surprisingly often from being here. It turns out I do have actual obligations with that job in Detroit and meetings I have to be at and classes to teach, so I can't actually physically be here as much as I would like to, so it is just a total pleasure to be able to do so. So thank you so much. Yes, so I did ethnographic fieldwork for my dissertation in both Wrocław and Poznan, although I did spend longer in Wrocław because I happen to know more people there, which is the kind of the behind the scenes of how a lot of ethnographic work gets done, is who you know in what places. And so many of the older adults with whom I spent time had a lot of, many people had very specific stories about their families' histories, either that they themselves moving from the Kresy to Wrocław or stories that they'd heard from relatives. But even people, even in the city, as those of you who know Wrocław know, Wrocław has a deep, deep love for Lwów, and so in many, and the Kresy in general, but Lwów in particular. And so many of the older adults with whom I spent time in, even at certain institutions, the Uniwersytet Trzeciego Wieku, for instance, the University of the Third Age, which was one of my field sites in Wrocław, had a whole cabaret group that was dedicated to Lwów. And they would sing songs from Lwów and sing songs about Lwów and about the region. And so there's very much a way that, yes, I was in Western Poland the whole time I was there, but I was also very much, in some senses, in the Krasa from the people with whom I was spending time, which actually brings me to one of the comments I had first thought of in response to your question about what do I take from the Polish case to other work, which is about the role and the vitality of the past in shaping the present, which I think is true in many parts of the world for all humans, et cetera. I could make some, and anthropologists don't really tend to make universalist claims, but the role of the past and the present certainly would be up there, kind of banal when you say it that way, but it makes, because the lifetimes, because in my own fieldwork, the oldest generations in Poland had lived through such dramatic transformations in nation, state, geography, culture, regimes, et cetera. Like the past is not taken for granted, and it was very, very much present and a vital part of what people wanted to talk to you about, which partially was because I was the younger than like American researcher coming to hang out with them, and that's the stories they want to tell about. But not only that, it's not only that. And so I think the kind of living through so much large-scale change just kind of denaturalizes the categories that you can take for granted if you do fieldwork or if you do research in a place that has more stability at the large-scale level, which I think actually has been something really interesting to think about in the last decade since I finished the doctoral work, is that, you know, the kind of global stability that made my work possible is so much a product of the post-war era. Speaking to personal trajectories, I came into the field, I started my PhD in 2004, so right as Poland joined the EU, which was actually how I came to it. I had a similar kind of journey of yours, Lenny, in the sense that I came with a comparative question and was kind of looking for a case. And because I came to Michigan, Poland became the obvious choice, but also because of the geopolitics of the time, I was able to catch the end of the Cold War funding. So I had, seriously, so I caught however many years, I was fortunate to have the FLAS fellowships that funded language study with Eva and Piotr, which was so amazing. I feel so fortunate for those years of support and all of the resources here at Michigan. And in my immediate postdoc time, I had a 1-semester fellowship at the Wilson Center, where I knew Liz Malinkin, that came in, I forget, it was a Title VIII, State Department Title VIII funding, and I forget the name of the program at the time, but it was something like, maybe Liz can help me, it was before the Global Europe program. I arrived and it was like something post-socialist Europe. But then I arrived and it was like, welcome to global Europe. And then that funding disappeared. And so there is a way in which I feel super aware of how the contemporary politics and world stability that I took for granted as growing up in the US in the 80s and 90s has really changed, has really made the kinds of work that I did possible that are not possible in the same way. I guess the other thing that I would kind of say about what working in Poland brings to my work in the US is kind of the importance of challenging stereotypes in many ways. I think because when I would talk to people and say, oh yes, I'm going to study aging in Poland, people would say, both Americans and Poles would say like, oh my God, that sounds so depressing. Your fieldwork sounds so depressing. That sounds so hard because maybe you were one of them, John.
No, I mean, I think aging is glorious wherever you are.
But you know, starość, nie radość. Like we have stereotypes, we have anti-ageist stereotypes both here and in Poland for sure that make it seem like a terrible experience to choose to spend your time that way. And so yes, not to deny that there are real challenges, of course, but even in hanging out, even spending time with people in the context that you would think would be the most depressing, in a dom pomocy społecznej, in a state welfare home, with people with real serious physical pain and challenges, that is not the only thing people experience all of the time. There's also moments of like joking, you have tea with your roommate, you like make fun of the nurse who's who's new and doesn't know how things work. There's a vital kind of vibrancy to kind of contexts that we have a frame around as already being negative, and I think that's really, I don't know if the Polish case makes that especially well, but I think aging in Poland kind of
my stereotype of aging in Poland as a North American is that elderly people have a place there and are respected as elders, and they help with childcare, they garden, they are very active. So that I would have and they also have the welfare state that kind of also helps them, whereas that's the Canadian in me also now jabbing at the American case. But
my quick rejoinder to that would be that might be a modernist story that we like to tell about aging, that it's always better elsewhere. Those people elsewhere always have it figured out, and that's not just my idea, but that's I think that might be part of that too.
Well, I'm a modernist then. Or an optimist.
Yes.
Ray?
I too have to start by thanking everyone. I know you're tired of being thanked. Stop thanking us already. Just move on to the discussion. But it really is. It's special to be here and to be around so many people that were so instrumental in who I am and what I do. And you can look around the room and each piece that I bring, or I like to think that I bring to the discussion, can attribute to each of you and all that you've taught me over the years. So thank you. So I think the answer that I have come to over the years is actually the answer that Lenny had when she started her PhD, which is that Poland is a great sort of tool for thinking about colonialism from a position in between, and I'm going to talk about that a lot. But I also want to show sort of kind of how I came to arrive at this question, because funny enough, of all the people that I knew while I was at Michigan, Lenny was not one of them. We somehow our paths never crossed. We just missed each other shortly, even though we were in the same program. So I had to come to this realization over years of study rather than just a conversation we could have had in 2005. But the journey has been a valuable one, I like to think. I came to this, to the question, I think in the opposite way from the two of you, in that I came to Michigan knowing Poland, and it was only over time that I realized I had to bring in other places. And it started as an effort to enrich my understanding of Poland, and only over time did I figure out what a powerful tool it could work in the opposite direction for understanding the world. So my story is also connected to Piotr Westwalewicz, and sitting in a Polish language class, listening to Polish new wave and punk, and learning that, of course, the early 1980s, everyone knows, is the peak of Polish new wave and punk music, which, as a sort of a burgeoning historian of Poland, I knew to be impossible, since everybody knows that Poland in 1982 was this place of brutal repression, which, of course, there is that truth to that story. But punk showed that there was also other things going on. And so I knew there was something there that had to be explored and unpacked. From a certain perspective, punk in Poland in the 1980s already introduced sort of a transnational dimension, because of course punk didn't just spring into existence in Poland. It was part of these broader global currents. Part of the story is also, a lot of the work on the book I did in Springfield, Missouri, where I got my first tenure track job, because there was a history job, I got it, I took it. This is post the market crash in 2008, 2009. And being in Springfield, Missouri, I don't think any of our students ever asked me anything about Poland. Made me realize that to feel like sort of part of the community, I had to explain what I was interested in studying in broader context. I'm really glad I did that. As it turned out, explaining why punk was in Poland was connected to all of these things happening around the world. While in the scholarship there are sort of a body of scholarship on punk in Eastern Europe and Poland that focused overwhelmingly on sort of the resistance to this oppressive state. In the US and the UK, the scholarship was, politics was involved, but was much more multifaceted, about sort of cultural study, media studies, much more varied. I realized that putting these different fields into conversation with each other revealed sort of commonalities across East and West, sort of similar narratives that were part of globalization in the 70s and 1980s, but also brought out ways in which there are common shifts happening in sort of global culture in the 70s and 80s that weren't apparent looking at either field sort of independently, where you can see, you know, looking at the Thatcher regime in the UK and then Jaruzelski in Poland, that there were surprising convergences there that I wouldn't have noticed if I were just reading Polish history. And seeing sort of the development of sort of the political model across multiple areas in the world, shifting toward politics defined by culture rather than social class in the 70s and 80s. So punk became a useful way of looking at the world, and the world became a useful way of understanding punk in Poland, sort of mutually. And as I was going through that journey, I came to this other question about colonialism in Poland, and that became intertwined with the next stage of my life, which hopefully I will be able to tell you later, because I think I've told you enough on this question.
Well, I'd like to piggyback on something you said about your students not caring about Poland or not knowing much about Poland, which you are at different institutions. I mean, at Michigan, we're lucky. We have a lot of people who work on Poland, and people, you know, care about Poland. Even if Ron would prefer perhaps that we cared about Armenia more. So how is it to be an academic and a teacher at a place where people don't care about Poland? And it's, you know, you need to make them care. So there's something about teaching about Poland and convincing people that it matters to study exotic places that are not so exotic anymore, or so how do you go about basically using the Polish case in your teaching? I'm going to just any of you can start.
I have things to say, but I was just talking a lot, so I'm gonna.
Can I start?
Yes.
Well, being a full-time administrator, I haven't had the opportunity to teach. I'm proposing a course for the spring about colonialism and its legacy. But being at the University of New Mexico, I think the Polish case will be extremely relevant. And I think that to get students interested, you have to make them appealing to it. So, for example, the case of migration in New Mexico, being at the border, so studying comparative cases and even contemporary topics as what's happening in Poland with the borders and how that is pushing to, you know, right-wing politics and policy, that it's very comparable to what we are experiencing in the U.S., especially at that part of our country, right? And also New Mexico is highly diverse and multilinguistic. So teaching about 19th century Polish cases will be very important, and it could be interesting to those students. But you have to, in New Mexico, University of New Mexico is not the University of Michigan, obviously. We don't have a Polish community over there driving programming, and Polish language is not even taught at the university, which is, it makes teaching about Polish history quite hard, because many of the sources you would like to use, they're not translated into English. So that's a challenge there. But just to say that you have to be creative and be very general with the courses that you teach. So you might advertise the course as I don't know, European colonialism, but then you teach about, you know, Polish and German
Poland
cases.
through the back door.
Yes. That's how I will do it there.
Yeah, I would say at Wayne State it's something similar. I mean, I am fortunate to be at Wayne State in that we do have colleagues who do focus on Poland, certainly not as many as here. And in anthropology, I do have a couple colleagues actually who work in Bulgaria and Romania, so not Poland, but within anthropology, I would say that Central Eastern Europe is not like the most popular part of the world that is studied, so I feel very fortunate to have at least some area studies colleagues more broadly there. However, the courses that I teach, our department is not large enough and our enrollments are not such that we could offer an area studies focused class. So like you're saying, Lenny, I teach courses in, you know, intro to cultural anthropology or general anthro theory or kind of topic focus like medical anthropology or kinship, things like that, that are fundamentally comparative because anthropology is an inherently comparative discipline. So one thing that I do is to keep including Poland, just put it on the syllabus, which is itself makes it part of the conversation, which is not necessarily taken for granted, I would say. And we are also fortunate in the sense that there are many students like here of Polish heritage, and so they come into anthropology or into the course with some interest from family backgrounds, which is really helpful. But I would also say that I find that, you know, many students have a kind of vague sense of like, oh yeah, Poland's somewhere in Europe. It's like towards Russia, but not Russia, and they don't, you know, students who come into intro anthro classes at the undergraduate level don't necessarily have a great understanding of world history. They maybe know something about World War II, something about socialism, but like what they actually know is very little. So I try to focus on the ethnographic stuff of the material itself and to really draw out people's actual stories and experiences to make it seem like the real place it is with the real issues and sets of relations and politics, etc.
That's great, and it's a perfect opportunity for me to continue with my narrative, my autobiography. In that, so I'm not in Springfield anymore. In case you were holding on to that part of the story, I'm in New York now. Very different place. You didn't need me to tell you that Springfield, Missouri is not New York. We do have Polish students in the City University of New York. But actually, that's not the piece that interests me about Polish studies. Also, like Lenny, it turns out my life is basically just following in your footsteps without knowing it.
No,
there's
I hope
not. There's an administrative side of my work as well. So I'm the faculty director of the honors program at John Jay. In John Jay College, part of CUNY is a Hispanic and minority-serving institution, very diverse student body. And on campus, we've had sort of our own conversation, as I'm sure this campus likely has, about decolonizing our own curriculum. And in that context, I saw Latin American studies, Africana studies, those area studies fields sort of leading the way in decolonizing the curriculum. Slavic studies, East European studies, East European studies, Eurasian studies, Polish studies, all of these fields were not in the lead of that conversation, I think for clear reasons. Latin American studies, Africana studies sort of are anti-hegemonic by their very nature, whereas Eurasian studies or Polish studies, East European studies are ambiguous. They have this even in the names, Russian and Eurasian, Russian and East European. East European has sort of this duality in it that muddies the water. Rather than trying to like claim part of the conversation, I think Polish studies and other studies in the region, I think there's an opportunity there for asking questions about in-betweenness. So for instance, in my own thinking about what it means to be a middle-aged, white, cisgendered man teaching predominantly women of color, thinking about my own sort of relationship there, I don't think of myself as part of the dominant class for all sorts of reasons that aren't immediately apparent when students look at me. That I'm a second-generation college student, that I'm Polish-American, which is invisible because my grandfather changed my name from Pozdrowski to Patton in the 1960s. But that's something you can do when you're Polish. It's not something you can do when you're black. So what does this mean for my own identity that I present as hegemonic, but my own identity is much more complex? I think Polish studies offers sort of that case scenario where you can look at what does it mean to be in between, what are the possibilities, and the very real challenges for how to relate to other people, particularly people of non-European descent. That's what the book is primarily about. How do you interact across difference when identities are never as simple as sort of dominant and subaltern? So I'm coming back to finally give the real answer to the first question, but also sort of speak to what I believe maybe Polish studies could be in the academy.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, when you're mentioning, the Russian and that's something that the previous panel mentioned too. I think that the war in Ukraine is pushing us to rethink why is there a center for Russian and, the rest. There's no question that Russian is the lingua franca of the region also, especially from the former Soviet republics. But I think that in the next few years, regardless of how long the war in Ukraine will last, it's really shaking how we think of Poland too, with a number of Ukrainian refugees, some of whom are passing through, but some others who decide to stay. And will they be assimilated the way that Poles are thinking that Ukrainians are a desirable minority because they are assimilatable, and the people on the Belarus border are not assimilatable because they are primarily people of color? Will also this kind of colonial imagination of Poles that Poles have of Ukrainians as the peasant, right? Because that's the imaginary that they have of the Kresy. The Poles were the nobility and the city folks, and local populations were peasants. Will become like the soldiers, the freedom fighters of the region, and the democratic heroes of the 21st century. So it's interesting to think also how the war in Ukraine is shaping how Poles in Poland might start reimagining different others. That's something that for us as scholars and teachers is actually really interesting to think about in terms of migration studies in contemporary society, and to think about what you said about thinking about the Polish border. There's several Polish borders, and the Belarus-Polish border and the one on Ukraine it's two worlds. And I think we've all read about the reaction to Agnieszka Holland's film. I had I won't say the pleasure, but I had the privilege of seeing it, on the day it opened in Warsaw. And it's a very important film that will be shown in the Polish Film Festival in Krakow because of the comparison between the Ukraine, Belarus, but also because it really goes back to issues of Polish-Jewish relations because of all the parallel that the film is making with Polish passivity and not complicity, but at least the very least passivity. I guess I'm talking about different things now, but it is related to things that we brought up in the previous panel on the importance of film, for example, in culture. And in our teaching, and how we can teach about U.S. debates about immigration, migration in places like New Mexico, and anti-immigration politics, and U.S. Presidential politics, and Polish ones, so that Poland is actually quite relevant in a lot of things that we're thinking, writing about. I don't know if you want to react to anything I said, or.
I guess I'll jump in on the piece that I think the role of Russia in Polish studies in some of my thinking that was sort of prodded by the previous panel. I think that's another example of how Poland is a useful case study, because I think Poland is a really interesting place to look at Russia from, right? Because there's certainly this very prominent sort of narrative of, of Russians oppressing Poles, and this is also a moment where one can kind of take relief in the news of saying, oh, Poles are finally, doing something good in the American media, right? They're being welcoming to Ukrainians. Yay! We can actually smile at Poland, which hasn't happened a lot in the last few years in the news. On the other hand, there's also this sort of second narrative in Polish history of orientalizing Russia, and I think that narrative is also important to remember, that when one starts to talk about Russia and its oppression of Poland, there's certainly a story there that needs to be told, but there's also a story of Poles orientalizing Russia, along with Ukraine, other peoples to the east, that forces one to sort of not have a knee-jerk reaction of casting Russia out as the oppressor and then celebrating oneself as the sort of defender of the weak, as itself a narrative.
Can I say something? Also, how this migration is shaping the dynamics internally. Last time I visited Poland was in 2016 for a conference in Gdynia, and then I went to Warsaw, and it didn't feel as welcoming as when I was doing research back in 2004 and 2005. So, and that was right after the refugee crisis. Mm-hmm. And I felt this tension and this, and it was, I think it was generational, because older population were treating me better than younger population at the supermarket and stores. So I haven't gone back, but it was shocking to me to experience that in 2016 after living there for a year in the early 2000s, and go about by myself to places and not have to worry about things.
One thing that I think about, and I returned to Poland last fall for just a very short visit of a couple weeks in both Wrocław and Poznań, and what the stories people were telling me about the war were, we always knew Russia and Russians were like this. Like, this validates our experience of them from World War II. This tells us what Russians are really like. And as true as that might feel in the moment, and is certainly borne out by the actions of the state, it makes me really, that kind of naturalizing language makes me really worried about these group of people are like X, this group of people is like Y, because we know empirically that's not true. That's just not true about humans across time and place. All kinds of people can do and all kinds of terrible things when circumstances are correct for that. And the kind of logic, like the use of history of, oh, this is familiar, this is exactly what has happened before, which of course there are, like, that's not wrong, but the move to naturalizing it feels really dangerous. And actually, just as I said it gives me chills just talking about it, because it feels so easy to make, for that logic to just seem like the obvious explanation. And I think that we have an obligation as scholars of Polish studies, who we know from working in this complex place across so many, like the historical work, the cultural work, across so many centuries, that it's just, there's so many different possibilities and possible ways that the world can be organized, and it's really, I think it makes the work that we do feel even more vital than it already did.
On this vital and the importance of the work that we do, I'd like to invite you to ask questions if you have any. We have a few minutes before. Yes, so, Roman, you have one?
Question to Lenny.
You need to, yes.
Question to Lenny that burns my soul, because I'm very interested in what you said about colonization and internal colonization in Poland. And there is a couple of books, I don't know if you are familiar, but talking about the post-colonial syndrome. Appears to be that societies cannot maintain democracy, that they revert to autocracy very quickly. And that happened in many colonial countries, even though the colonies left them with, especially the British, left them with the institutions which should run as democratic institutions. They would revert to autocracy very quickly. And I was wondering if you ever run into a question about Poland, who was colonized by 150 years almost, whether the reason why Poland cannot maintain democratic system of governance is a post-colonial syndrome because it was colonized. So we are looking at the same problem, maybe we can find the same solutions. And Poland was, after the 150 years of being colonized, it reverted to, after 1918, to democracy for a very short period of time. 1935, autocracy comes. Then there was World War II, and after World War II, there was an autocratic government because it was communist, but then solidarity comes, there is 20 years of democracy, and then we are reverting back to autocracy that's being built by peace government. Did you look into that situation as a... Please do. Let's talk to me about it.
I didn't, because as a historian, I'm very concerned about the particularities based on context. So, and when I write, I'm very conscious that I'm writing from the German side of the Polish partitions. Mm-hmm. And I do, when I study my subjects, they're in conversation with Poles from other partitions, but I'm very hesitant to make sweeping generalization about colonialism. It's the same when I'm comparing Poles to Africans in the 19th century. Yes, the colonial discourse is similar, but it's not the same, because after all, Poles in the German side of the partitions had a voice in parliament. They could denounce crimes and things like that Africans didn't. So for that reason, I don't study the consequences of 100 years of Polish colonial relations. So, but it's an interesting proposition what you're making.
Thank you all for being here and providing your perspectives. My question is about connections and legibility. Sorry, I might get dark here with how we. As we try to expand what it means to do Polish studies, and as we start to push those boundaries of what it is that we do, it seems to me that there's also this issue of, when you start to decenter things, like where do you go for like very practical things like funding or jobs? And I was wondering if you could maybe speak to, like, as we're starting to think about the future of area studies, the future of our institutions, where do you see being able to have conversations about what it is we do, as we, very rightfully become very, pliable, flexible in our thinking. We're doing innovative work, but when it's not centered, it seems like there's a loss.
I'm not sure if I can. I'm not sure if my answer is optimistic or pessimistic. I'll let you decide. So my experience, my life was has been a way of trying to answer that question. I think in coming to Michigan and having this incredibly rich sort of center for Polish studies, and looking to where can I go and be part of that somewhere else, and realizing that in fact I could not, because there are a handful of those places, and they're not hiring all of the people who graduate with PhDs to go work at them. So I think my experience looking for a job was sort of grappling with the trauma of redefining what it meant to be to have my expertise in a context where that wasn't there wasn't as much desire for that as there were people looking to be part of it. Fortunately, I figured out a way of sort of using those skills and sort of reimagining who I was and what I did that allowed me to bring what I learned to new contexts, administrative as well as academic. So thinking about how Polish studies and my background there could made me a better administrator at a place like the City University of New York. And could sort of speak to concerns beyond scholars interested in Polish studies. And actually, I'm feeling optimistic now because it's taking me to my the project I'm working on now. Whereas I think I genuinely feel now, to a degree that I don't think I felt in the past, that in studying Poles writing about colonialism and sort of relating to people from the global South, there are lessons in that are really valuable for everyone, not just people inherently interested in Poland. So while that transition was hard, I think the place I ended up is actually okay.
Yeah, one final word.
I guess I would just say that and I think about this now that I'm training doctoral students in anthropology, which is really morally heavy work to be doing given the job market, right? That you have to always be thinking about, and this is maybe another way of saying what you're saying, the multiple ways that your work is relevant to different kinds of audiences. I didn't get a job because I study Poland. I got a job because I study aging. And so, which was strategic and it worked out.
But I think that certain fields are more amenable to that. Yeah. So you could be in history, you study a place and a time. Yeah. In anthropology too. In you said you found it. What is it? You say you found a job, not in spite, but
not because I
found a job in spite of working in Poland. And that's very different.
Yeah.
So in sociology, you're supposed to be working in general.
Yeah.
Unless you work on the U.S., right?
Right.
If you work on the U.S., you're not an area specialist, you're a generalist. Working on Poland, and I remember for me at my first, the dean's first reception, I remember meeting a famous anthropologist who's asking me, and I tell her my sociology spiel about religion and nationalism and whatever, and she interrupts me and she said, honey, where? This is something in sociology people would not ask because you're not supposed to have a where. So, but given, and that's something that Keely hinted at that we didn't talk about, jobs in academia, the job market is shrinking. So that now, even if you're in a field where the where matters, you need to be very nimble and flexible in order to make whatever your area, your field site, be relevant. Because of the job market. So I really hate to end on this kind of downer.
It's an opportunity.
Because the job market is difficult. But I would like to thank our panelists. So please join me in thanking them. Thank you.